Hey everyone, welcome to In 10 Minutes. My name is Tony D. Please smash like and subscribe. Check out my books, Wokistan and the Pineys. Today's topic is legalization of drugs. I was on Twitter, and I'm not often on Twitter. I don't really like Twitter, but I'm a big fan of Razorfist. If you haven't seen his videos, they're really great. Check them out. And he started a discussion thread about legalization, and he was pointing out that hasn't really worked out so well in Colorado because the bureaucracy is so bad that the black market continues to flourish. And, which is a valid point. I think, however, the legalization of drugs and prostitution would pretty much collapse most of the major crime families because of the way they make most of their money. And it works something like this. And again, my background is I wrote Complete Mafia for D20, which is a game book, but 2 years of research went in it. And so I think I have a pretty good grasp of the criminal economics. So imagine a pyramid, and everything in the pyramid flows up to the top. All the money flows up. At the bottom of the pyramid, you have street prostitutes, street-level drug users, and those people pay their pimps and their street drug dealers. And then there's different levels of those. You know, you can go higher up and get better class of prostitute or drugs or drug dealer. Those people eventually pay some sort of street tax either to an associate who is sometimes a supplier, sometimes the guy who runs the hotel where people could have sex or whatever. But these associates are considered, they're not members of the family, not official members, but they're protected members of the families. They are people you don't mess with because particular maid guys are friends with them and do business with them, so you don't mess with them. So in other words, if you run a brothel, you might have a friend who's a maid guy in a family, and he's your protection. So if you ever have a problem, you go to him. Now, those maid guys may pretend to be your friends, but they're also exploiting you too, because you pay the street tax to him. And so the associates pay the soldiers, which is the lowest ranked members of the family. They then pay the street tax to the capo. The capo runs a crew. And a crew in a family might be anywhere from 5 to 8 soldiers, depending, sometimes bigger, very rarely smaller. And depending on the size of the family, you may have several crews and many capos. Those capos then pay a street tax to the underboss. Now, there's only one underboss in a mafia family, usually, and he is sort of the part of the three-way top of the pyramid. The underboss runs the day-to-day operations of the family, collects the money, and he works closely with the consigliere, who he's about equal to, depending on the family. Now, some families, there's some unequal distribution of power, but the consigliere, of course, is like the lawyer type. He'll wash the money. He protects the boss. He protects the family and is the legit face of the family. And then finally you have the boss. And the boss makes all the decisions. And he has to be insulated from the rest of the pyramid so he stays clean in the typical, hierarchy. Now, sometimes it's different. Sometimes in The Sopranos, Tony Soprano was an underboss, but he was very powerful, and then Junior became the boss, but he was really a figurehead, and he was there to sort of distract everybody while Tony actually handled the money and did things. That was based on what was happening in the Philadelphia mob a few years prior to that. There have been cases where underbosses become very powerful, and then eventually they become the boss. Sometimes the consigliere becomes very powerful, and he becomes the boss. Sometimes the bosses are just so powerful that the underboss and the consiglieres are just a second thought, and they just do whatever the boss says. It depends on the family. They can run in any sort of direction. But all that money comes up the pyramid and exchanges all those hands and eventually gets to the boss. And that's why the boss becomes very rich. They can exploit people who take drugs or use prostitutes, they can exploit the prostitutes because it's all illegal. Any illegal operation can be exploited in your territory. That's what these guys do. So whether you run a massage parlor or there used to be a lot of illegal gambling operations, not so much anymore. A lot of gambling's legalized. Whether you run a chop shop or whatever, if you are in a territory, you're going to pay a tax. And if you don't, you may not be noticed for a long time, but once they find you, they're going to exploit you because who are you going to call? Who are you going to call? So if you legalize drugs on a federal level, and it would have to be on a federal level, this and prostitution as well, the pyramid would collapse. Now, Razorfist accurately points out that the black market is still alive in Colorado, but this is mostly because, I believe, of the bureaucracy surrounding the legalization in Colorado, but also because the cartel still is making a fortune outside Colorado. I think if you looked at their sales prior to legalization and now, you would see a precipitous drop. And the families would have to kick up their game, even in the black market, to compete with private. Because in a private enterprise, they're going to have the protection of the police. They're also going to do things to appeal to users that, it's safe, quality, all those things are going to be much easier to do in a private setting than it is in a criminal setting, because criminals will rip you off. That's what they do. They will do anything to make another dollar. The guy who runs your local weed shop, he wants you back as a customer. He cannot rip you off. I mean, he can, but he's going to pay for that. You could return your pot and get angry and vow never to shop at his place again and go to his competitor. You kind of can't do that to a criminal, right? I mean, you could stop buying his pot, but he's already got your money. He doesn't care. So at a federal level, if drugs and prostitution were legalized, the profit would just evaporate out of most drugs. Because it would be legal, everybody in a 1,000-mile radius would be growing pot, opium, cocoa leaves. Everybody would be growing it to make their own because it would be so much cheaper. Or because there's money in it. At least for a while there would be. That's why if you legalize prostitution, I mean, look, they legalized prostitution in Nevada, right? There's still illegal prostitution all over the place. It hasn't stopped, sex trafficking or any of that. But if you legalize prostitution across the United States, sex trafficking would be over. There'd be no need for it. They couldn't make money doing it because it would be totally legal. They would be competing against every college girl who wants a sugar daddy, they would be competing against the Uber of prostitution because there would be instantly apps for prostitutes and they'd be everywhere and they'd be cheap as hell because they'd be competing with each other and they'd have all kinds of reviews and stuff. They already have that stuff now and it's illegal. At the moment that it's legal, in countries where it's legal, they have that stuff. They would have that all across the United States. There would be franchises. Strip clubs would turn into brothels like overnight, some of them. And there'd be so many of them. For a while, there'd be money because it would be novel and be new. Everybody would be like, oh, I'm going to try out on prostitution. And then after a while, it would just collapse and it would plateau to something that would be quote unquote normal price. Same thing with drugs. For a while, it would be novel, but then all the companies that wanted to get into this business would get into it. They would make synthetic drugs. They would make synthetic heroin and cocaine, stuff that wasn't addictive, stuff that would have a cleaner high, wouldn't give you a headache, stuff that would light you up for exactly an hour and then, suddenly stop. They can do that with all these drugs if they're legally allowed to do that and sell it to people. But they're not. So they always have to run this risk, like the guys who made salvia and all these other synthetic drugs, they always got to run the risk that the government's going to come down and lower the boom. But if you legalized drugs, the price would go out the window, and there'd be no reason, to buy your drugs from someone who's a criminal can be a scary proposition. It's not always scary. Sometimes it's just some kid who he's taking all the risk buying the pot or buying the coke or whatever. But you don't want to go to a sketchy neighborhood and get robbed. People have gotten robbed buying pot or buying coke or, trying to get a prostitute. They've gotten robbed and ripped off. But if you legalize it, that would be almost never. And if you did get robbed or ripped off, you'd just call the cops. And that would take a while to, sort of sink in with people who are in that world, regular drug users and users of prostitute. It would be a while before they'd be like, oh yeah, I could call the cops. Hey, my prostitute didn't give me sex, or hey, my drug dealer didn't give me my coke, or whatever. I mean, it would take a while for that to affect. In the meantime, the cartels couldn't exploit those people. They would try to. Some of them would stubbornly hang on, I predict, for a little while. But ultimately, they would have to give up the ghost. And the historical precedent for it is Prohibition. When Prohibition ended, the Mafia was ready. They knew, way in advance. And they divested all their money out of booze because they knew there wasn't going to be as much profit in it anymore. And they didn't really want to make booze. They do illegal things to make tons and tons of money really, really quickly. So they knew the money was going out of it. They moved into gambling. They moved to Vegas. They got into Teamsters and all kinds of stuff back in the 60s and 70s. That was the end result because they were sitting on piles and piles of money. A lot of them, they would go legit or retire. That's what some of these cartel guys would do. The top echelon guys would retire. The guys below, if they have their money, they're going to retire. If they have a way to get into some sort of business. I think a lot of the Mexican cartels, they're just going to, go into government. Maybe just, buy lots of land and be into real estate or whatever. There's not going to be enough money in it for these cartels. There is going to be a bloodbath, and I think Razor's right about that, and he mentioned something about that in the thread. There will be a bloodbath because there are a lot of people in the cartels and in crime families who are very violent. They're rough people, and they got into it to intimidate people and shoot people and beat them up and do all sorts of horrible things. When the family essentially dissolves, what do? It's like the Ronin in the Edo period in Japan. Like they're just going to roam the countryside looking for trouble. That's what's going to happen for a while. I think a lot of those guys will end up in jail. They'll end up dead. They'll probably just start robbing people or trying to get into what illegal, things like human trafficking will still be, viable even if they legalize drugs, getting people across the borders. I think a lot of the cartel members, a lot of the rough ones will try to take over the coyote business if they don't already have a hand in it. And it will be a bloodbath for a while. But those guys will die off, go to jail, retire, and eventually there's just going to be less and less crime for them to commit. Once you legalize the drugs and prostitution, what's left? If gambling's legal, prostitution's legal, drugs are legal, you can rob people, but there's always a risk assessment with criminals. Robbing somebody is risky. They could have a gun. They might not have anything. You could break into the house for nothing. You could get caught by the cops. You can get videotaped. It's a huge, huge risk. So, these guys don't get into criminality for risk. They get into criminality for a shortcut. They're opportunists. So if you cut off all the income streams that are easy, they're going to say, well, it'll just be easier to get a job. It'll just be easier to scam people or, do something online or whatever. It's going to be a lot less violent world if you legalize drugs. Also, all the drug dealers, they're not going to have guns. They're going to call the cops. 90% of their protection, they will have some guns. They will have some security. But, basically once they get the idea of like, oh, well, we could just use the cops, they're going to be the guys they call. They're not going to have a team of enforcers anymore to go beat up on another rival gang who's in their territory. They won't be able to do that anymore. They'll just be able to call the cops and say, hey, these guys came over and robbed us or whatever. So I think legalization is a good thing. I think it can work. I think ultimately it's going to be a long road to get there. But, we've made inroads legalizing pot. I would like to see pot and prostitution. I think in the short term, them legalizing federally would be a good thing. So, write your congressperson and say, hey, legalize the fun stuff. That's what I say.